Hello, this is Brian, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 20th issue of the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Mark Carney delivers veiled broadside at Donald Trump and U.S. power as he calls for new global alliances. Prime Minister Mark Carney says Canada and other middle power countries must stop pandering to unnamed great powers that are upending global trade and territorial boundaries and form new strategic alliances to protect their interests, citizens, and values. In a hard-hitting and wide-ranging speech that nevertheless did not name U.S. President Donald Trump, but made reference to American hegemony, Carney set out the basis of Canada's foreign policy in the face of a crumbling, rules-based international order. Values-based realism will form the basis of Canada's approach, said Carney, guided by adherence to basic principles and accepting that there will not always be complete alignment among those nations that must form new alliances to survive an era where great powers are using economic integration as weapons, tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, and supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. It was as clear a broadside at the U.S. president and his America First policies as any Carney has delivered since last spring's election campaign, when his elbows-up rhetoric was spicier, more challenging, and critical of Trump than it has been since the Liberal leader took office amid a trade war. The speech laid out Carney's overarching intention to strike alliances with like-minded countries in an era where, he said, the old rules-based order is dead. Countries should resist the impulse to go along to get along, to accommodate, to avoid trouble, to hope that compliance will buy safety. It won't. Instead, he urged action based on principles, pragmatism, and a realization that there is strength in numbers when it comes to surviving the current global upheavals. We aim to be principled and pragmatic, said Carney, principled in our commitment to fundamental values, sovereignty and territorial integrity, the prohibition of the use of force except when consistent with the UN Charter, respect for human rights, pragmatic in recognizing that progress is often incremental, that interests diverge, that not every partner shares our values. We are engaging broadly, strategically, with open eyes. How exactly Carney intends to apply this approach when it comes to challenging Trump on Greenland is not clear. Carney reiterated that when it comes to Arctic sovereignty, Canada stands firmly with Greenland and Denmark and fully support their unique right to determine Greenland's future, and is unwavering in its commitment to NATO's mutual defense pledge that an attack on one is an attack on all. He said Canada is working with NATO allies and 8 Nordic and Baltic nations to further secure the alliance's northern and western flanks, including through unprecedented investments in over-the-horizon radar, submarines, aircraft, and boots on the ground. But neither Carney nor his officials clarified exactly what actions Ottawa is prepared to take to defend Greenland and Danish sovereignty in the region. Although the Star and other outlets have reported he is considering sending troops there. And Carney did not outright criticize Trump as the U.S. president ramped up overnight his rhetoric around his plan to take control of Greenland. Trump has already threatened tariffs against 8 European nations who voiced opposition to his taking over Greenland, including Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. Trump said in a social media post that he'd slap a 10% penalty on those countries, which would climb to 25% on June 1st, if he did not have a deal by then for the complete and total purchase of Greenland by the United States. It's going to be a very interesting Davos, Trump said. Trump arrives in Davos in the wee hours of Wednesday, and it is not clear whether Carney will meet with him. Trump has scheduled meetings with foreign leaders for Wednesday, and on Thursday will make an announcement here about his Board of Peace charter. Carney's government is now signaling that the Canadian Prime Minister is reconsidering whether to join Trump's Board of Peace to oversee the reconstruction of Gaza. Carney said on Saturday he'd accepted Trump's invitation in principle. That was before Trump publicly confirmed that he has invited Russian President Vladimir Putin to join the Board of Peace. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne told reporters here that a final decision had not yet been made, as he said Canada would not pay the $1 billion price tag that Trump is reportedly setting to join the board as a permanent member. Officials had earlier said Canada was not asked to pay any entry fee. The Prime Minister will have to make the final decision when all the facts are known and all the details have been hammered out, whether this is in the best interest of Canada to be part of the process, Champagne said. In his keynote address, which followed other European and Chinese leaders who spoke earlier in the day, the Canadian Prime Minister reprised a line he first used in China last week, where he made a deal to reduce Ottawa's 100% tariffs on electric vehicles from China that had matched the U.S. in order to win tariff relief on Canadian canola and seafood. Carney said then that Canada will do business with countries like China where it makes sense. On Tuesday here, he said Canada will take on the world as it is, not wait for the world as we wish it to be. Middle countries must forget the fiction that the rules-based international order can, or ever did, really protect them and stop accommodating great powers which are bullying the rest of the world. In a speech that was peppered with references to Thucydides, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, and former Czech dissident Václav Havel, who went on to become president. We knew the story of the international rules-based order was partially false, that the strongest would exempt themselves when convenient, said Carney. This fiction was useful, and American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. But the last 2 decades, which have seen a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics, laid bare the risks of extreme global integration, said Carney, and the bargain no longer works. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination, Carney said, quoting Havel. Carney said he understood why many countries are concluding they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance, and supply chains. But he urged them to band together because when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what is offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It is the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. Carney said that countries should instead share the cost of strategic autonomy, of sovereignty, adding that collective investments in resilience are cheaper than everyone building their own fortress, at a time when other institutions like the WTO, the UN, and the Conference of Parties on Climate Change are failing to protect middle countries. He said it doesn't amount to naive multilateralism, nor is it relying on diminished institutions. It is building the coalitions that work issue by issue with partners who share enough common ground to act together. A time of rupture calls for honesty about the world as it is, Carney said. The old order is not coming back. We should not mourn it, he said, reiterating his oft-stated adage that EU President Ursula von der Leyen also quoted here. Nostalgia is not a strategy. Nearly a fifth of Americans now prefer that Canada become a U.S. state or territory, poll suggests. 17% of Americans support Canada becoming either a territory or the 51st state of the U.S., but 2/3 stand by its sovereignty, a new poll suggests. The findings come amid U.S. President Donald Trump's ambitions to seize Greenland, a self-governing territory of fellow NATO member Denmark, after capturing former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and toppling his government earlier this month. But according to the survey by a public opinion pollster research company, most respondents don't want the U.S. to take over Greenland, nor do they want Panama, Cuba, or Mexico under American control. It's a topic I've never thought I would have to ask about, said Mario Canseco, the president of research company and author of the survey. Americans are not looking at Greenland the same way Trump is looking at it. Published Monday, Canseco's survey polled a representative sample of 1,002 adults across the U.S. from January 13th to the 15th. Here's what it found. What do Americans think of Canada becoming the 51st state? Although 66% of respondents said they'd prefer Canada remain an independent nation, 10% said they'd like to see it become a territory of the U.S., and 7% its 51st state. Republicans were more likely to want Canada absorbed into the states, with 13% wanting it to become a territory and 10% an American state. But despite Trump's messaging, 64% of Republicans support Canada's independence. It's definitely a larger number of people wanting Canada under U.S. control than what we would have found prior to Donald Trump becoming president, Canseco said. The number is definitely significant. I mean, it's 1 out of 5. It doesn't suggest that the public is completely on side, but there's a group that could be growing, he said. I'm curious to ask this in 6 months and see where the situation stands. Last March, an Angus Reid Institute poll asked a similar question and found 60% of Americans had no interest in seeing Canada join the U.S., while 32% were interested, but only if Canadians want to. Canadians don't want to if the 90% of Canucks who are against annexation of the pole were anything to go by. Most Americans don't want to take over Greenland. Trump has said the U.S. needs Greenland, but most Americans don't seem to agree. 56% of Americans wanted the autonomous territory to stay autonomous, while 16% were in support of it becoming U.S. territory and 7% a U.S. state. Canseco noted that the situation is drastically different from the beginning of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, when a majority of the population was in support of military action based on false claims that the nation possessed weapons of mass destruction. It's not as if Trump's got the public on his side on something that is significantly more drastic than going into Iraq, he said. What Americans think of U.S. expansionism. Similarly, few Americans want Cuba, Panama, or Mexico under U.S. control, the survey found. More specifically, 57% supported Cuba as an independent nation, while 22% would prefer it as a U.S. territory or state. For Panama, 54% respected its sovereignty, while 24% would rather have it under American control. 67% of Americans supported Mexico as an independent nation, slightly more than those in support of Canada, while 10% wanted it as a territory and 5% as a state. Meanwhile, 24% of respondents said they'd prefer if the unincorporated American territory of Puerto Rico became an independent nation. 17% wanted it as a state, while 43% would rather Puerto Rico remain a territory. I think the real message, more than anything, is the element of the U.S. once again becoming the world policeman is not something that is resonating with the public, Canseco said, noting a disconnect between policymakers and the general public. They are probably more concerned about the housing situation, the cost of living, and the price of gas. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Trump's ICE force is sweeping America. Billions in his tax and spending cuts bill are paying for it. a ballooning immigration and customs enforcement budget, hiring bonuses of $50,000, swelling ranks of ICE officers to 22,000 in an expanding national force bigger than most police departments in America. President Donald Trump promised the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history, but achieving his goal wouldn't have been possible without funding from the big tax and spending cuts bill passed by Republicans in Congress, and it's fueling unprecedented immigration enforcement actions in cities like Minneapolis and beyond. The GOP's big bill is supercharging ICE, one budget expert said, in many ways that Americans may not fully realize, and that have only just begun. I just don't think people have a sense of the scale, said Bobby Kogan, Senior Director of Federal Budget Policy at the Center for American Progress and a former advisor to the Biden administration's Office of Management and Budget. We're looking at ICE in a way we've never seen before, he said. Trump's big bill creates massive law enforcement force. As the Republican president marks the first year of his second term, the immigration enforcement and removal operation that has been a cornerstone of his domestic and foreign policy agenda is rapidly transforming into something else, a national law enforcement presence with billions upon billions of dollars in new spending from U.S. taxpayers. The shooting death of Renee Good in Minneapolis showed the alarming reach of the new federalized force, sparking unrelenting protests against the military-styled officers seen going door to door to find and detain immigrants. Amid the outpouring of opposition, Trump revived threats to invoke the Insurrection Act to quell the demonstrations, and the U.S. Army has 1,500 soldiers ready to deploy. But Trump's own public approval rating on immigration, one of his signature issues, has slipped since he took office, according to an AP NORC poll. Public sentiment is everything, said Representative Nydia M. Velasquez, Democrat, New York, at a press conference at the Capitol with lawmakers supporting legislation to impeach Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Americans, she said, are upset at what they are seeing. They didn't sign on for this, she said. Border crossings down, but Americans confront new ICE enforcements. To be sure, illegal crossings into the U.S. at the Mexico border have fallen to historic lows under Trump, a remarkable shift from just a few years ago when President Joe Biden's Democratic administration allowed millions of people to temporarily enter the U.S. as they adjudicated their claims to stay. Yet as enforcement moves away from the border, the newly hired army of immigration officers swarming city streets with aggressive tactics in Los Angeles, Chicago, and elsewhere is something not normally seen in the U.S. Armed and masked law enforcement officers are being witnessed smashing car windows, yanking people from vehicles, and chasing and wrestling others to the ground and hauling them away, images playing out in endless loops on TVs and other screens. And it's not just ICE. A long list of supporting agencies, including federal, state, and local police and sheriff's offices, are entering into contract partnerships with Homeland Security to conduct immigration enforcement operations in communities around the nation. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican Louisiana, has warned Democrats that this is no time to be playing games by stirring up the opposition to immigration enforcement officers in Minneapolis and other places. They need to get out of the way and allow federal law enforcement to do its duty, Johnson said at the Capitol. Noem has said the immigration enforcement officers are acting lawfully. The department insists it's targeting criminals in the actions, what officials call the worst of the worst immigrants. However, reports show that non-criminals and U.S. citizens are also being forcibly detained by immigration officers. The Supreme Court last year lifted a ban on using race alone in the immigration stops. Trump last month called Somali immigrants garbage, comments that echoed his past objections to immigrants from certain countries. The Trump administration has set a goal of 100,000 detentions a day, about 3 times what's typical, with 1 million deportations a year. Money from the big bill flows with few constraints. With the Republican control of Congress, the impeachment of Noem or any other Trump official is not a viable political option for Democrats, who would not appear to have the vote tally even among their own ranks. In fact, even if Congress wanted to curtail Trump's immigration operations by threatening to shut down the government, for example, it would be difficult to stop the spend. What Trump called the Big Beautiful Bill is essentially on autopilot through 2029, the year he's scheduled to finish his term and leave office. The legislation essentially doubled annual Homeland Security funding, adding $170 billion to be used over 4 years. Of that, ICE, which typically receives about $10 billion a year, was provided $30 billion for operations and $45 billion for detention facilities. The first thing that comes to mind is spending on this level is typically done on the military, said Kathleen Bush Joseph, a political analyst at the Migration Policy Institute. Trump is militarizing immigration enforcement. Ahead, Congress will consider a routine annual funding package for Homeland Security unveiled Tuesday, or risk a partial shutdown January 30th. A growing group of Democratic senators in the Congressional Progressive Caucus have had enough. They say they won't support additional funds without significant changes. Lawmakers are considering various restrictions on ICE operations, including limiting arrests around hospitals, courthouses, churches, and other sensitive locations, and ensuring that officers display proper identification and refrain from wearing face masks. I think ICE needs to be totally torn down, said Senator Ruben Gallego, Democrat, Arizona, on CNN over the weekend. People want immigration enforcement that goes after criminals, he said, and not what he called this goon squad. Big spending underway, but Trump falls short of goals. Meanwhile, Homeland Security has begun tapping the new money at its disposal. The department informed Congress it has obligated roughly $58 billion, most of that, some $37 billion, for border wall construction, according to a person familiar with the private assessment but unauthorized to discuss it. The Department of Homeland Security said its massive recruitment campaign blew past its 10,000-person target to bring in 12,000 new hires, more than doubling the force to 22,000 officers in a matter of months. The good news is that thanks to the Big Beautiful Bill that President Trump signed, we have an additional 12,000 ICE officers and agents on the ground across the country, Assistant Secretary Tricia McLaughlin said in a December statement. The department also announced it had arrested and deported about 600,000 people. It also said 1.9 million other people had voluntarily self-deported since January 2025, when Trump took office. Trump administration urges judge to reject Minnesota's attempt to stop its immigration crackdown. The Trump administration is urging a judge to reject efforts by Minnesota and its largest cities to stop the immigration enforcement surge that has roiled Minneapolis and St. Paul for weeks. The Justice Department called the lawsuit, filed soon after the fatal shooting of Renee Good by an immigration officer, legally frivolous. Lawyers argued that the Department of Homeland Security is acting within its legal powers to enforce immigration laws. Operation Metro Surge has made the state safer with the arrests of more than 3,000 people who are in the country illegally, the government said Monday in a court filing. Put simply, Minnesota wants a veto over federal law enforcement, Justice Department attorneys wrote. Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison said the government is violating free speech and other constitutional rights with its unprecedented sweeps. He described the armed officers as poorly trained and said the invasion must cease. The lawsuit filed January 12th seeks an order to halt or limit the enforcement action. More filings are expected, and it's not known when U.S. District Judge Catherine Menendez will make a decision. Elon Werman, who teaches constitutional law at University of Minnesota Law School, doubts the state's arguments will be successful. There's no question that federal law is supreme over state law, that immigration enforcement is within the power of the federal government, and the president, within statutory bounds, can allocate more federal enforcement resources to states who've been less cooperative in that enforcement space than other states have been, Werman told the Associated Press. Julia Decker, policy director at the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, expressed frustration that advocates have no way of knowing whether the government's arrest numbers and descriptions of the people in custody are accurate. U.S. citizens have been dragged from their homes and vehicles during the Minnesota surge. These are real people we're talking about, that we potentially have no idea what is happening to them, Decker said. In a separate lawsuit, Menendez said Friday that federal officers can't detain or tear gas peaceful protesters who aren't obstructing authorities. Good, 37, was killed on January 7th as she was moving her vehicle, which had been blocking a Minneapolis street where immigration and customs enforcement officers were operating. Trump administration officials say the officer, Jonathan Ross, shot her in self-defense, although videos of the encounter show the Honda pilot slowly turning away from him. Since then, the public has repeatedly confronted officers blowing whistles and yelling insults at ICE and U.S. Border Patrol. They, in turn, have used tear gas and chemical irritants against protesters. Bystanders have recorded video of officers using a battering ram to get into a house, as well as smashing vehicle windows and dragging people out of cars. Police in the region, meanwhile, said off-duty law enforcement officers have been racially profiled by federal officers and stopped without cause. Brooklyn Park Police Chief Mark Booley said he has received complaints from residents who are U.S. citizens, including his own officers. Every one of these individuals is a person of color who has had this happening, Booley said during a news conference. He said he believes the stops have been conducted by a small group of individuals and not all agents in the area. President Donald Trump last week threatened to invoke an 1807 law and send troops to Minnesota, though he has backed off, at least in his public remarks. The miracle, 6-year-old girl, is a family's sole survivor in Spanish train wreck. The roar was deafening inside the train car as it hurtled off the tracks, then slid down a steep slope, ripping open its frame, and then, amid the twisted metal of the wreckage, the cries of the injured and the silence of the dead. Surrounded by bodies after the train accident in southern Spain, one little girl somehow emerged virtually unscathed. Newspaper La Vanguardia reported that a civil guard officer found her barefoot on the tracks after she escaped through a broken window. Relative Juan Barroso told reporters the 6-year-old is in good health after receiving 3 stitches in her head at a hospital. The mayor of her family's village said he was finding a measure of solace in the fact this girl was out of harm's way. There are many people who are very sad for the victims of this terrible accident, but there were also many who survived, like the miracle of the girl who is safe, Punta Umbria's mayor, Jose Carlos Hernandez, told reporters Tuesday, after leading a minute of silence for the victims. Among them were the girl's parents, brother, and a cousin. At least 41 people were killed in the brutal accident that has shaken the nation and left the 6-year-old child an orphan. Her family's last names are Zamorano Alvarez, the town hall said, but the Associated Press is not disclosing her first name. Punta Umbrea has declared 3 days of mourning for victims, including the Zamorano Alvarez family. They were seated in the front carriages that bore the brunt of the impact when a train coming the opposite direction suddenly jumped its track for reasons still unknown. Mayor Hernandez said that the girl is now with her grandparents in a hotel in Cordoba, the nearest city to the crash. She has a tremendous family who will do what it takes for her to have a happy life, the mayor said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Despite Greenland, Francis Macron and NATO's head make nice with Trump behind the scenes. While Europe is pushing back publicly against U.S. President Donald Trump over Greenland, the language appears softer behind the scenes. Trump published a text message on Tuesday that he received from French President Emmanuel Macron, confirmed as genuine by Macron's office. Starting with "my friend," Macron's tone was more deferential than the criticism that France and some of its European partner nations are openly voicing against Trump's push to wrest Greenland from NATO ally Denmark. Before broaching the Greenland dispute, Macron opted in his message to first talk about other issues where he and Trump seem roughly on the same page. We are totally in line on Syria. We could do great things on Iran, the French leader wrote in English. Then he added, I do not understand what you are doing on Greenland, immediately followed by, let us try to build great things. That was the only mention that Macron made of the semi-autonomous Danish territory in the 2 sections of message that Trump published. It wasn't immediately clear from Trump's post when he received the message. Trump breaks with tradition. World leaders' private messages to each other rarely make it verbatim into the public domain, enabling them to project one face publicly and another to each other. But Trump, as is his wont across multiple domains, is casting traditions and diplomatic niceties to the wind, and in the process, lifting back the curtain on goings-on that usually aren't seen. This week, a text message that Trump sent to Norway's Prime Minister also became public, released by the Norwegian government and confirmed by the White House. In it, Trump linked his aggressive stance on Greenland to last year's decision not to award him the Nobel Peace Prize. Considering your country decided not to give me the Nobel Peace Prize for having stopped 8 wars plus, I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace, the message read. It concluded, the world is not secure unless we have complete and total control of Greenland. On Tuesday, Trump also published a flattering message from Mark Rutte, Secretary General of NATO, which the alliance also confirmed as authentic. I am committed to finding a way forward on Greenland, Rutte wrote. Can't wait to see you. Yours, Mark. Rutte has declined to speak publicly about Greenland despite growing concern about Trump's threats to acquire the island and what that would mean for the territorial integrity of NATO ally Denmark. Pressed last week about Trump's designs on Greenland and warnings from Denmark that any U.S. military action might mean the end of NATO, Rutte said, I can never comment on that. That's impossible in public. Macron's relationship with Trump. Macron likes to say that he can get Trump on the phone anytime he wants. He proved it last September by making a show of calling up the president from a street in New York to tell Trump that police officers were blocking him to let a VIP motorcade pass. Guess what? I'm waiting in the street because everything is frozen for you, Macron said as cameras filmed the scene. It's a safe bet that Macron must know by now, a year into Trump's second spell in office, that there's always a risk that a private message to Trump could be made public. Macron said Tuesday, that he had no particular reaction to the message's publication when a journalist asked him about it. I take responsibility for everything that I do. It's my habit to be coherent between what I say on the outside and what I do in a private manner. That's all. Still, the difference between Macron's public and private personas was striking, hosting Russia and Ukraine together. Most remarkably, the French leader told Trump in his message that he would be willing to invite representatives from both Ukraine and Russia to a meeting later this week in Paris, an idea that Macron has not voiced publicly. The Russians could be hosted in the margins, Macron suggested, hinting at the potential awkwardness of inviting Moscow representatives while France is also backing Ukraine with military and other support against Russian President Vladimir Putin's invasion. Macron wrote that the meeting could also include the Danish, the Syrians, and the G7 nations, which include the United States. The French president added, "Let us have a dinner together in Paris on Thursday before you go back to the U.S." He then signed off simply with Emmanuel. Making nice only goes so far. Despite Macron's persistent efforts in both of Trump's terms not to ruffle his feathers, any payback has been mixed at best. Trump bristled on Monday, threatening punitive tariffs when told that Macron has no plans to join Trump's new Board of Peace that will supervise the next phase of the Gaza peace plan, despite receiving an invitation. Well, nobody wants him because he's going to be out of office very soon, Trump told reporters, even though the French leader has more than a year left in office before the end of his second and last term in 2027. I'll put a 200% on tariff on his wines and champagnes, and he'll join, Trump said. Russia's top diplomat says NATO faces a deep crisis over Greenland. The bid by U.S. President Donald Trump to take over Greenland heralds a deep crisis for NATO and raises questions about the alliance's preservation as a single military political bloc, Russia's top diplomat said Tuesday. It was hard to imagine before that such a thing could happen, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said at a news conference, noting it could create a scenario in which one NATO member is going to attack another NATO member. He said Trump's actions upended the Western concept of the rule-based global order that Russia has long criticized, even after Moscow sent troops into neighboring Ukraine nearly 4 years ago. Now it's not the collective West writing the rules, but just one its representative, Lavrov said sardonically. It's a major upheaval for Europe, and we are watching it. The Euro-Atlantic concept of ensuring security and cooperation has discredited itself. Denmark's control of Greenland was a vestige of the colonial past, Lavrov claimed. In principle, Greenland isn't a natural park of Denmark, he added. At the same time, Lavrov strongly denied Trump's suggestions that Russia and China have any intentions to threaten the Arctic island. We have no relation to that, he said. We are certainly watching the serious geopolitical situation and will make our conclusions when it's settled. Speaking at an annual news conference on Moscow's foreign policy priorities, Lavrov also offered cautious approval of Trump's initiative to set up a Board of Peace. The organization initially was seen as a mechanism focused on ending the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, but is taking shape with ambitions to have a far broader mandate of other global crises, potentially rivaling the United Nations. The Kremlin said that it was studying Trump's invitation to join the board and waiting to hear more details from Washington. This initiative reflects the U.S. understanding that even with the foreign policy philosophy it considers necessary to rally a group of nations that would cooperate with them, Lavrov said. He praised Trump's initiatives to negotiating an end to fighting in Ukraine, describing the U.S. as the only Western country that has expressed understanding of the need to take Russian interests into account and offered solutions taking into consideration the root causes of the crisis. At the same time, Lavrov scolded Kiev's European allies for trying to amend the U.S. proposals as the Ukrainian army facing a relentless Russian onslaught. The top Russian diplomat argued that while the initial Trump's proposal that was accepted by President Vladimir Putin at their summit in Alaska envisioned protections for Russian speakers in Ukraine and Moscow-affiliated Ukrainian Orthodox Church, it was removed from the plan's latest version proposed by Kiev and its European allies. Moscow wouldn't accept such changes, he said. We won't allow the luxury of once again letting the Kiev regime take a break and rearm, Lavrov said. He noted that while Moscow doesn't rule out contacts with European leaders, most likely we won't be able to agree with them on anything, as they drove themselves too deeply into hating Russia. But Lavrov also criticized the U.S. for its capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro and his transfer to the U.S. to face drug trafficking charges in the U.S., calling it a crude military intervention. He said Moscow is still waiting for the U.S. to make good on a promise to release 2 Russian crew members from a Russia-flagged tanker seized by the U.S. earlier this month, and he also noted U.S. threats to Cuba and other Latin American nations. Lavrov noted Washington's refusal to accept Putin's proposal to respect the limits on nuclear weapons set by the New START Arms Control Treaty for another year after it expires next month. Russia is ready to continue dialogue with the U.S. on the basis of mutual respect for natural interests, Lavrov said. He said that during U.S.-Russian talks in Riyadh in February, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio emphasized the need for cooperation where their interests allow it and prevent disagreements from growing into confrontation. I responded that I fully share this philosophy and logic, Lavrov said. Baby dies from cold in Gaza as leaders meet to discuss Trump's board of peace. A Palestinian baby died from hypothermia on Tuesday in the Gaza Strip, underscoring the grim humanitarian conditions in the territory as world leaders were gathering at a Swiss resort where President Donald Trump's Gaza ceasefire plan is high on the agenda. Shaza Abu Jarad's family found the 3-month-old on Tuesday morning in their tent in the Daraj neighborhood of Gaza City. She was freezing and dead, the baby's father, Mohammed Abu Jarad, told the Associated Press by phone after a funeral. She died from cold. The man who worked in Israel before the war lives with his wife and their 7 other children in a makeshift tent after their house was destroyed during the war. The family took the girl to the Al-Hali hospital, where a doctor pronounced her dead from hypothermia, said her uncle, Khalid Abu Jarad. The health ministry confirmed that the baby died from hypothermia. The family is among hundreds of thousands of people sheltering in tent camps and war-battered buildings in Gaza, which experiences cold, wet winters with temperatures dropping below 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit at night. As Palestinians in the war-ravaged enclave languish in displacement camps, Trump hopes to establish his new board of peace at the World Economic Forum in Davos. But the initiative, initially conceived to oversee the Gaza ceasefire, faces many questions over its membership and scope. Israel on Tuesday began demolishing the Jerusalem headquarters of the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, pressing ahead with its crackdown against a body it has long accused of anti-Israel bias. Shaza Abu Jarad was the 9th child to die from severe cold this winter in Gaza, according to the Strip's health ministry, part of the Hamas-run government and staffed by medical professionals. The UN and independent experts consider it the most reliable source on war casualties. Israel disputes its figures, but has not provided its own. More than 100 children who have died since the start of the ceasefire in October, a figure that includes a 27-day-old girl who died from hypothermia over the weekend. The ceasefire paused 2 years of war between Israel and Hamas militants and allowed a surge in humanitarian aid into Gaza, mainly food. But residents say shortages of blankets and warm clothes remain, and there is little wood for fires. There's been no central electricity in Gaza since the first few days of the war in 2023, and fuel for generators is scarce. The International Committee of the Red Cross said recent biting cold and rainfall in Gaza were ultimately a threat to survival. Trump's board of peace was initially seen as a mechanism focused on ending the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, but recent invitations sent to dozens of world leaders, show that the body could have a far broader mandate of other global crises, potentially rivaling the UN Security Council. Trump says the body would embark on a bold new approach to resolving global conflict, an indication that the body may not confine its work to Gaza. The panel was part of Trump's 20-point ceasefire plan that stopped the war in Gaza in October. Many countries, including Russia, said they received Trump's invitation and were studying the proposal. France said it does not plan to join the board at this stage. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Toronto Star on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Iran warns Trump not to take action against Khamenei. Iran on Tuesday warned Donald Trump not to take any action against the country's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, days after the U.S. president called for an end to Khamenei's nearly 40-year reign. Trump knows that if any hand of aggression is extended toward our leader, we not only cut that hand, but also we will set fire to their world, General Abbas Shekarchi, a spokesman for Iran's armed forces, said. The comments came after Trump described Khamenei in an interview with Politico on Saturday as a sick man who should run his country properly and stop killing people, adding that it's time to look for new leadership in Iran. Tension between the U.S. and Iran has been high since a violent crackdown by authorities on protests that began over Iran's ailing economy on December 28th. Trump has drawn two red lines for the Islamic Republic: the killing of peaceful protesters and Tehran conducting mass executions in the wake of the demonstrations. The USS Abraham Lincoln, which had been in the South China Sea in recent days, had passed through the Strait of Malacca, a key waterway connecting the South China Sea and Indian Ocean, by Tuesday, ship tracking data showed. A U.S. Navy official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said the aircraft carrier and 3 accompanying destroyers were heading west, while naval and other defense officials stopped short of saying the carrier strike group was headed to the Middle East. Its current heading and location in the Indian Ocean means it's only days away from moving into the region. It would not be the first time in recent years that a carrier strike group deployed to the Pacific was moved to the Middle East to address instability in the region. The Abraham Lincoln was rerouted to the Middle East in 2024. Last June, the USS Nimitz strike group was ordered to the region. The death toll from the protests has reached at least 4,484 people, the U.S.-based human rights activist news agency said Tuesday. The agency has been accurate throughout the years of demonstrations and unrest in Iran, relying on a network of activists inside the country that confirms all reported fatalities. The Associated Press has been unable to independently confirm the figure. The death toll exceeds that of any other round of protest or unrest in Iran in decades, and recalls the chaos surrounding the 1979 revolution that brought the Islamic Republic into being. Although there have been no protests for days, there are fears the number could increase significantly as information gradually emerges from a country still under a government-imposed shutdown of the internet since January 8th. Khamenei said on Saturday that the protests had left several thousand people dead and blamed the United States. It was the first indication from an Iranian leader of the extent of the casualties. A further 26,127 people have been arrested, according to the human rights activist news agency. Comments from officials have led to fears of some of those detained being put to death in Iran, one of the world's top executioners. National Police Chief General Ahmad Reza Radan has said those turning themselves in would receive more lenient treatment than those who don't. Those who were deceived by foreign intelligence services and became their soldiers in practice have a chance to turn themselves in, Radan said in an interview carried by Iran's state television on Monday. In case of surrender, definitely there will be a reduction in punishment. They have 3 days to turn themselves in. He did not elaborate on what would happen after 3 days. Palestinians endure systematic abuse in Israeli prisons, rights group says. Thousands of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons are enduring a systematic, institutionalized policy of torture and abuse, one of Israel's leading human rights organizations said in a report released Tuesday. Based on interviews with 21 Palestinians released from detention as part of the October 2025 ceasefire, the Israeli rights group B'Tselem said prison conditions had led to deaths and irreversible health damage. The group said former detainees spoke despite threats of rearrest if they shared details of their experiences. Israel's prison service said it categorically rejects the false allegations, contending it operates lawfully, is subject to oversight, and reviews complaints. Any concrete complaint submitted through the official channels is examined by the competent authorities in accordance with established procedures and the law, it said in a statement. Israel's military and Shin Bet, who are responsible for arresting prisoners and conducting interrogations, respectively, did not respond to requests for comment. In a report titled Living Hell, B'Tselem detailed what it described as a grave pattern of sexual violence in detention facilities and prisons, including threats of sexual abuse and physical assaults, such as beatings to the genitals that cause severe injuries. The report also said detainees were subjected to forced anal penetration with objects. The report described ongoing organized violence, including beatings, electric shocks, and the use of tear gas and stun grenades. Living conditions, the group said, are marked by severe overcrowding, shackling, and limited access to food and hygiene. Denied adequate medical care, some detainees have undergone amputations or reported loss of eyesight or hearing. Few of the allegations are new. However, B'Tselem said the accounts point to an institutionalized policy of torture and abuse, backed by Israel's political and judicial systems. Far from being carried out in the shadows, the systematic abuse is put on public display with no attempt to conceal or obscure it, the report said. In fact, the persons in charge boast about it openly. The number of Palestinians in Israeli detention surged after the start of Israel's war with Hamas, while thousands of people have since been released, including nearly 2,000 as part of the October ceasefire agreement, in which Palestinians were exchanged for Israeli hostages still held in Gaza. Some 9,000 remain in detention. The Associated Press has previously reported on the dire conditions in prisons and detention centers through interviews with released detainees, their families, lawyers, and prison staff, who described medical neglect, abuse, and deaths in custody. Father of Canadian teen found dead near pack of dingoes in Australia shares tribute. How can we ever forget you? The Canadian found dead on a beach surrounded by dingoes has been identified as a 19-year-old woman from British Columbia named Piper James. Her father, Ted James, posted a touching tribute on social media Tuesday after his daughter was identified in Australian media reports. Our hearts are shattered as we share the tragic loss of our beautiful daughter, Piper. We will always remember her infectious laugh and her kind spirit. I admired her strength and determination to go after her dreams, James wrote on Facebook. He went on to say how she loved and was proud of her work with BC Wildfire Services. Piper would work hard so she could play hard. So many are going to miss you, my precious little baby girl. Maybe gone, but how can we ever forget you? James added in a post with several photos of the deceased, including images showing her firefighting and riding motorbikes. Police in Queensland, Australia, said they were notified about her body around 6:35 a.m. local time on Monday, when officers were called to a beach at Garry, formerly known as Fraser Island. Police Inspector Paul Ansley told reporters it wasn't known how the woman died, but that her body had come in contact with a pack of dingoes. Dingoes had physically been in contact with the body, he said at a news conference. We simply can't confirm whether this young lady drowned or died as a result of being attacked by dingoes. Brianna Falk, a friend of the victim, told the Canadian press that James was a lover of life and nature and always down to talk. The pair met 3 years ago through their high school English class in Campbell River, British Columbia. We had so many plans, and she was so young, Falk said. You never think that it is going to be somebody that you know, let alone one of your closest friends. Global Affairs Canada said in a statement to the Star that they were aware of the death of a Canadian citizen in Australia. We extend our condolences to the family and loved ones. Canadian officials are providing consular assistance to the family. A Queensland police news release said the body was found north of the Mahano shipwreck, a landmark on the eastern side of the island. Initial information suggests the woman may have gone for a swim around 5 a.m., and an investigation into the circumstance of her death is ongoing, the release said. The Australian Broadcasting Corp said police are now awaiting the results of a post-mortem examination, which is expected to happen on Wednesday. 2 men driving on the island first spotted the victim, who was unresponsive and surrounded by a large pack of dingoes on the beach Monday morning. She was declared dead shortly after police arrived, according to the news release. Garry is a UNESCO World Heritage Area that is described as the world's largest sand island and known for its population of wild dingoes, with the Queensland government warning visitors to be dingo safe. Dingoes, widely regarded as a subspecies of the wolf, are similar to domestic dogs in their size and habits. They typically stand around 2 feet tall, with adults weighing between 26 and 44 pounds, according to Britannica. There have previously been dingo attacks on Garry, including the fatal mauling of 9-year-old Clinton Gage in 2001, and an incident in 2023 when a woman who was jogging on the beach was chased into the surf and attacked. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 20th issue of the Toronto Star. Your reader has been Brian. Thank you for listening.